Welcome to The World This Week, in which Consortium News looks at the events around the globe over the last 7 days. This week, Davos, the fallout from Trump, Carney, and Greenland. Ukraine, Zelensky also made an appearance at Davos and blasted Europe, and an article by Sy Hersh. And then Australia, where Parliament passed a law that could put someone in prison for criticizing Israel. This week, I'm joined by Patrick Lawrence, a columnist for Consortium News, an author, a former Asia editor of the International Herald Tribune, and you can follow him on his Substack, The Flautist. Patrick, welcome back to The World This Week.
Thank you, Joe. Good to be with you again.
Let us begin with the Davos events, which the entire world is talking about. This is a gathering every year in Switzerland of the most powerful people in media, politics, finance. There's a lot of conspiracy theories around them getting together to plan the next year, what they want to do in the world, the elite of the elites. Give us your overview of this year's Davos, and then I want to dig down into Mark Carney's speech, the Prime Minister of Canada, Trump's incredibly long Castro-like address to this gathering, and then, of course, the issue about Greenland that supposedly or may have been resolved.
Yeah, I think the key word came out of the key speaker. Carney's speech was quite remarkable in many dimensions. And the word I'm thinking of is rupture, right? He made it clear we are not talking about a transition in the global order, right? The good old rules-based order, but a rupture. Okay, you and I imagine many in our audience have ambivalent at best attitudes toward the rules-based order, but we can get to that in a minute. This was a real moment, and I think what we have to look at from here on out, he sought to inspire what he called small and medium nations, meaning Canada and the Europeans, basically, to draw together and act coherently in their own behalf. I could not be more delighted if this came to be. One has waited decades, no exaggeration, for the Europeans to find their voices and their feet, and they haven't until now. But I think the Greenland question and Trump, more broadly, Trump's absolutely astonishing conduct these past days and weeks are forcing this question on the Europeans. And I'd like to see the Atlantic grow wider, to put it in a phrase. And Davos could be a marker. The other thing we probably want to talk about is the posture assumed by the Danes. Very important. If I can dilate on that for a moment, we touched on this last week. The Prime Minister of Greenland, Mr. Nielsen, and the FM of Denmark, Mr. Rasmussen, had an appearance at the Oval Office and got absolutely nowhere with Trump. He shut them right down, and they left. And the consensus was that went very badly. I told you last week, I didn't think that went badly at all. I thought it went excellently because the Danes and the Greenlanders took the occasion to say, absolutely unacceptable, this business about Greenland. The Danish PM, Frederiksen, has since dug her heels in really very admirably. In effect, the Danish are forcing the Europeans to look at themselves and decide how they're going to manage this situation. So I thought Davos was really somewhat pivotal. We will have to see. Some people have argued that Carney said some splendid things. Whether he lives up to them is another matter. I suppose that's certainly true. right?
I want to ask you about Carney, but before that, I just want to explain what happened apparently and get your take on the Greenland issue.
Yeah.
Trump went in, guns blazing, we're taking it over. That's it. He said even at the beginning of the meeting, you can give it to us, but we'll remember if you don't. Well, he said threatening things like, "We'll remember if you don't give it to us." And on the way out, he's made a deal apparently with Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, in which Trump will get the United States will be able to build as many bases as they want in Greenland and put as many troops they want there and missiles and et cetera, et cetera. And apparently they already had that agreement from a 1950 era's treaty. They were able to do that in Greenland anyway. So he's really got nothing. And it looks like this is one of these instances where he goes in with his maximalist real estate. We're going to take the whole neighborhood, and then he winds up getting buying one little shop on the corner. So what exactly happened in your view? Did they stand up to Trump? Did he kind of humiliated himself, didn't he there?
Well, he did get one thing out of it, Joe. On the ground, you're quite right. There's a treaty dating back to the early 50s, giving the Americans all the rights they could want by way of a military presence there. What did he get out of it? He got out of it what he always wants, a narcissistic self-aggrandizement, right? That's what he got out of it. Now,
He did
Ruta
he didn't purchase Greenland, but go
Fredrickson,
on.
Fredrickson, Prime Minister of Denmark, quickly made the point, who is Mark Rutte to negotiate in behalf of Denmark? This situation is becoming very incoherent on both sides of the Atlantic. A couple of other things I would like to mention here. Quite notable in the Carney speech, this business of the rules-based order. He came out and said, it always was, his word, something of a lie. It was an order that we subscribed to so long as it suited our purposes. And we must now acknowledge that it never really was an order. Well, you and I knew that, and members of our audience knew it. But the important thing is who is saying it, you know? Who's
Yep.
saying it?
But let's put it this way. As one commenter pointed out, the global South has been suffering this type of bullying from the North for the longest time. And when Canada was part of that, they had no issues with it. Now they are
Yeah.
feeling the bullying of the United States. So now they're speaking up against it. That's number one. Number two, there's a new president after Trump. There will be. He may go right back to the way it was all the way, back to Biden, back to Obama, back to the rules-based order. Do you think Mark Carney is going to complain again? I think this is just a temporary, uh, from the Europeans and Canada in this case, a temporary rupture with Trump, not with the United States. What do you think?
Interesting, interesting. You caused me to raise a question. Why do you think Carney spoke so vociferously on the way to ferociously? Why do you think he did that?
Because, as I said, Canada has been bullied. First of all, Trump keeps making statements he's going to take over the country. And number two, the tariff issue. I think this has been a real problem for the Europeans, for the Chinese, and the Canadians, who are the largest trading partner with the United States. So it
Yeah,
really hurts them. So I think that this is a Trump issue, not a United States issue. I think if the U.S. returns to the way it was, which is to be the global power, bullying everybody else except Canada and their allies, that's fine. They don't mind being vassals. So I find a lot of hypocrisy in Mark Carney, and I also think there's overblown this idea that he's made this incredible break with the rules-based order. He did say yes that it was a kind of hypocritical thing. We always knew that the major power, the United States, was going to do whatever they wanted, and it wasn't necessarily fair. So that was a slight admission there, and that Canada is what he's saying is Canada's been aware of this a long time, but we kept our mouths shut and kept our heads down because it was good for us. He basically said in those exact words and he
yeah,
used this Václav Havel um, analogy where Havel says in the communist Eastern European communist system worked because the shopkeeper put workers of the world unite sign in there, even though he didn't believe it. Nobody believed it. I'm not sure nobody believed that, but anyway, and therefore they went along with the lie. But once one shopkeeper takes down the sign, then the lie starts to crack. And he was the shopkeeper in this thing, taking that down. But was he taking it down to show that the American Pax Americana was a lie, or Trump is the problem because he's now bullying Canada?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, Joe, old problem among correspondents. Some among us tend to mix up two verbs, should and will, right? This should happen, therefore it will. I am eagerly awaiting the extent to which the Europeans have been forced by this last week's events to learn some measure of independence, right, in policy and so forth, right? I hope that's true, but you're quite right. We can't rely on that. Europeans have behaved very badly. And a qualifier here, a big qualifier, I was thinking about this as before we began. Yeah, for a long time, I during the Cold War and since, where are the Europeans? I would like to see them stand up and become an independent pole of power, in the way you mentioned Havel, in the way Havel wished, right? Wrote wrote eloquently about. But I now have to qualify this. It may be that the Europeans are now going to at least begin some process whereby they develop some authentic capacity to conduct themselves independently. Okay. But my qualifier is this: after all this waiting, look what they're doing, to the extent that Trump has shoved them out on their own on the Ukraine question. Look what they're doing. They're freakishly Russophobic, destroying the, in many ways, enviable welfare state economies of the post-war era in behalf of their very own military industrial complexes, right? So my enthusiasm for an independent Europe is somewhat tempered. As we said last week, I think these European leaders have no practice thinking for themselves. And when they're thrown back on their own intellectual resources, they can't think of anything to do but imitate the Americans at their Cold War worst, right? To put it very simply.
I think for years, both of us have looked to an independent Europe as being the most important thing that could develop in the world, because a Europe that has good relations with both East and West, with the US, with Russia, with
Yeah.
China, but has its own foreign policy and maintains the social democracy that it had that's rapidly eroding as well. And we saw snippets of this with Ostpolitik, of course, with Willy Brandt, this is a long time ago, being able to accommodate with the Soviet Union. And we saw twice in the last century where France led a rebellion against the United States in Europe. That would be France leaving NATO under de Gaulle. And then in the early 21st century, in the debate over whether to invade Iraq or not in 2003, where the French led, and de Villepin, I mentioned last week, made a speech at the UN Security Council, and it was France that led the rebellion and voted against the US invading
Mm.
Iraq. And of course, they went ahead and did it. But it was Britain, and Germany did go along with France in that instance. But now you talk about the Russophobia. Britain and Germany drive that. I don't think France is as Russophobic as the Germans and the British. And that is not going to change. So I don't have any optimism that I don't think Mark Carney goes into that trilogy with de Gaulle and de Villepin, with NATO in the 20th century and at the early part of this century, the rebellion against invading Iraq. Those were monumental landmarks in a possible
Yeah.
European independence. I don't see, first of all, Mark Carney is Canadian, but even as part of the vassal states of the United States rebelling, I think this is a short-term anti-Trump matter. And once Trump's off the scene, we're going to go back, I'm afraid, to the same rules-based orders as before, because then it'll be working for Mark Carney again. It isn't right now.
Yeah. I think Carney had just by way of him personally, I think he's put himself out there uh, on a platform with nobody else on it, and he will either prove his mettle or turn himself into a public failure, and, to take your own word, a hypocrite, right? So we will have to see about Mark Carney. you know.
He-
In one way, he has a very great deal to lose. Canadian relations with America are absolutely dreadful, right? But on the other hand, if you're dealing with an erratic president who keeps pushing and pushing and pushing, and another of his points was, you go along cooperating in the hope this will save you, and it won't. Good point on his part. So let's see where he is, right? I guess I tilt toward you. It'll be this sort of glow will fade rather quickly.
yeah, Mark Carney is no radical. He was the head of the Central Bank of England when
Yeah.
they seized Venezuela's gold, which they still hold. He was part of that operation and a big supporter.
He
He is
ran
an
the BOE
imperialist.
at
He
that
is not
time.
an anti-American imperialist. He's anti-Trump. That's the only point I'm making.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
He was the head of the Bank of England, yes,
I
Canadian.
didn't realize that he was oversaw the theft of the gold.
Well,
Right.
I know it was his decision alone, but he was involved in it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I want to move on to David Sanger, who is not one of my favorite people. I was once in a room with him at the U.S. mission to the UN, and Samantha Power was the ambassador then, and she had a background briefing for reporters, and I was in on it. And there was Sanger, who took up the entire time from all the other reporters there and just berated Power and the American officials there as if he was the Secretary of State. It was quite a display. And I'm not saying I didn't even necessarily disagree with some of the things he was saying. It was the way he was seeing it. So Sanger sees himself as really a major player in world affairs, as someone who could really kind of arrange the way things are going to happen. So he wrote this piece about Davos, in which an omnibus piece, talks about Carney and Zelensky, which we're going to get to, but of course about Trump and Greenland. And he said that he went in there like his New York real estate agent, and made all these demands, and then he walked out with nothing. And I think I agreed with that part of Sanger's analysis, that this was a humiliation for Trump, but he'll just sweep it under the carpet, like that's what we wanted all along. But also he raised this point that we might come here again in a couple of weeks, that Trump wants all of Greenland because he has to psychologically, he needs to own it. That's what he told the New York Times reporters in that
Yeah,
very long interview he gave the Times
yeah.
group of time in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago. So we may hear it again that he wants all the Greenland. He walked out with very little. And I think that they pulled the rug out from under him by flattering the hell out of him, and then leaving him with this bad deal, which we'll have to see whether it takes place. But Sanger went on to talk about the end of the global that Trump is threatening the post World War II system that the United States created, the way countries could deal civilly with one another. And I think this piece, and I think you probably will agree with me, and I want to hear your
Mm.
thoughts on this. This piece lays out some of the core myths and assumptions that the American press and government have about themselves and about America's place in the world, that's repeated day after day after day. So we shouldn't wonder why Americans and other Westerners are so deluded about how the Western countries, particularly U.S., behaves in the world, and why some countries are not happy. Not Mark Carney. I'm talking about China and Russia and Africa and Latin America. These countries. Why are so many countries so upset with the United States? And for example, Sanger says that the U.S. created this system that, along the way, quoting him, brought huge advantages to the United States, extending its reach and amplifying its power. And he writes, after Greenland, nothing will be quite the same in the Atlantic Alliance. I don't. I want to challenge that. Quote, the perception of how America envisions using its military and economic power has shifted, perhaps permanently. For the first time since the end of World War II, the country that created the modern system of how civilized nations interact spent several weeks threatening to turn its military and economic power towards the cause of expanding American borders. To the Europeans, Washington suddenly appeared to be the enemy within. And then he quotes this guy, Richard Fontaine, who was the chief executive of the Center for New American Security and a former aide to Senator John McCain, right? Fontaine
Yeah.
says the principle behind the threats is disturbing. Quote, the prohibition against conquest is a key feature of the post 1945 world, and one that has helped keep the peace among great powers, coveting Greenland and threatening to acquire it, possibly by force, upends that. There's so many lies in those statements by Sanger and Fontaine. First of all, Britain and Rome ran indirect empires. The idea that the U.S. now, because they want to physically take Greenland, that is a new development of American empire. It just belies the fact that the U.S. has had an empire since the end of the Second World War,
Yeah.
and they have not behaved in civil ways, and they've invaded Panama and Afghanistan and Iraq. And what about Vietnam? So the end of the Second World War, this system that the U.S. created, Truman, unlike maybe what FDR would have done, Truman allowed France to regain its colonies in Southeast Asia after the Japanese were kicked out. That was just the re-establishment of empire, which led to the Vietnam Wars, the French and the American one. Anyway, what are your thoughts on these issues?
Uh, Sanger, I knew David in Tokyo, right? I remember when he left, he said, well, in sort of faux modesty, well, they want me to go to Washington and take care of national security questions for them, right? So he's been doing that. He must have left Tokyo in late 80s, 90 or so. He's been at it a long time. He is uh, unhealthily close to the national security state, and we will leave it at close to because we'll just that's enough, right? I thought that a couple of points on that piece. One, it's just glow in the dark American exceptionalism, right? And we don't live historically in America. We live mythologically, right? We live according to the myths we tell ourselves, and we're rather surprised if the rest of the world doesn't buy into them, right? That's one point. The second is there's an element of racialism in this that has been all over the Times this week. Peter Baker, an extraordinarily hacky White House correspondent, he's covered 5 presidents and read his stuff for a while, and you know exactly why they keep him there, right? He did the same thing as Sanger. This is instruction to our audience how to read the New York Times, right? He did the same thing as Sanger, except more shockingly, he said, well, it is true from time to time, America has compromised the sovereignty of other nations and toppled governments and so forth. But it is true, he said. But now we're doing it to allies, subtext. Now we're doing it to Western countries, subtext of subtext. Now we're doing it to white people, right? This is how I read it. David, my final point about David, uh, perhaps of interest. I think he is a very, very faithful uh, representative of national security state thinking. Okay. And read that piece again with this in mind. And I think we can detect that Trump with Greenland has been racing in his impulsive narcissism, almost a paranoid self-regard, right? I think he has been, in effect, maybe wrong verb, but I'll use it, racing ahead of the national security state. And the national security state probably does have interests in increasing its American presence in Greenland, but buying it, invading militarily, and so on and so forth. I think what you saw in David's piece was that's not how we want to do this.
There's another David at Washington Post, David Ignatius, who fulfills the same role as Sanger. They
Yeah.
got they got their men, the intelligence services do. But just to follow up, one other thing that Sanger wrote that is just unbelievable myth is, and that has to be reinforced constantly, is that he writes in an era of so many urgent threats, from China's menacing of Taiwan to Russia's appetite for European territory beyond Ukraine. How did Greenland emerge as Washington's most urgent security concerns? First lie. And you know Asia better than I do, having been the Asia editor of the International Herald Tribune. But I understand that China will not move against Taiwan unless it declares independence.
Yeah,
It is a part of China right now. It does not like the U.S. arming them or Nancy Pelosi visiting them or any other way of bestowing upon Taiwan the idea that it's a separate independent state. But until they actually declare independence, and most of Taiwanese businessmen, from my 3 times having visited Taiwan, they are very happy with the economic relationship with mainland China, and they have been for more than 20 years or more now.
yeah, yeah,
To Russia not having any appetite for the European territory of Ukraine, because on the one hand they say they can't even take over Donbass in 3 years, and here now they're going to be in Paris by Christmas. I mean, it's just a big lie, both of them.
yeah, yeah. I mean, America never does anything offensively. It always acts defensively.
Exactly.
Therefore, Russia must want to make its way to London and Lisbon, right? There's
Yes,
not, it makes my blood boil when I hear this stuff. There's not a shred of evidence for it, but it is extremely destructive, and it keeps great numbers of New York Times readers all pepped up with Russophobia and righteousness in the way we're talking about America's doing the right thing, indispensable nation, and so forth, right? David. I mean, I think it's useful. I think that piece was useful in the way I earlier suggested. It's useful if you read it carefully. It's very useful in reckoning up the distance between the national security state and the madman in the White House, right? I don't think his carrying on is appreciated in great quadrants of the American security state, right? I don't think it
exactly.
is.
I
Right?
looked up just to be certain about how extensive did Britain and Roman Empire and the British Empire use proxy leaders around the world or client kingdoms. And it was extremely extensive by both the Romans and the British. And this is how the US runs its empire. But
Yeah,
that's not never acknowledged that if we overthrow Saddam Hussein with our own American troops there, and then withdraw to some extent, and we leave behind a government loyal to the United States. This is what they did
yeah,
in South Vietnam. It's everywhere. They're now trying to do this in Venezuela, co-opt the government there. This is the way the U.S. runs an empire. But because the U.S. has been recently out of the business of direct territorial conquest, i.e., first the North American continent from the Native Americans, 10 invading and taking Hawaii, Florida from Spain, Mexico, and a war against Spain and Mexico, take the rest of the United States. And then it kind of, we settled into this, the United States did a proxy indirect rule around the world, but that's never acknowledged. It's now Trump's going to go back to McKinley to directly take chunks. And that's something we cannot, in America, we can't accept that. And totally
yeah,
ignoring everything that has happened before and the power that the U.S. enjoys.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you use a key word. Indirect rule is the scholar's definition of how the British ran their empire, right? We're embarking now on indirect rule of Venezuela, right? Depending on how you want to interpret what's going on down there, right?
Absolutely.
Trump was basically for a short while saying, no, I want the whole thing and I want sovereignty. Well, that kind of broke the banks, of the river, in that he was talking about direct rule. And it's just, again, forgive me for repeating myself, it's not what the Beltway establishment has in mind. It's just not. In that way, I thought the Sanger piece was important. But once again, you have to know how to read the New York Times to get this stuff out of it, right?
Right. And
You
just to
know,
put a bow on Sanger now, he says this is Trump's performance leaves America's allies with uncomfortable choices. It is one thing to declare that the United States can no longer be trusted. Let me stop there. Is he only now discovering that the United States cannot be trusted? I mean, I think plenty of countries have learned that going from Native
a
Americans not
long
trusting,
time
not
ago.
yeah, about all the treaties the U.S. signed with the Native American tribes. let alone the Minsk Accords. I mean, there's a long, continuous history of that.
Yeah. One other point about David's piece. Um, well, he wrote, it would take many years and billions of dollars for the Europeans to develop the wherewithal to act on their own, and they just don't have the stomach for it. Okay, um, I, I don't think. First of all, I that may or may not prove true. I, I I would like to think it in the long term it doesn't. And my thought when I read that paragraph was you can't describe a region or a nation's aspirations as eternally impossible. It may be a long road, most certainly it will be, but if the Europeans don't step up to the plate, that will not be the reason why, right?
I was about to read that very paragraph because I think inherent in that is a real defensive empire and an exposition of where violence is such an important part of all of this and how Europe better be careful. Because he writes, and this is the full quote, it would take decades and hundreds of billions of dollars to replicate what the Pentagon has built up over generations. The Pentagon. For
Yeah.
few countries in Europe have the stomach for that, nor do they possess the budget or technology. What does this mean? You can't break with the United States. We got the firepower, baby, the Pentagon. You
Yeah.
don't cross the United States. You'll never be able to build up that kind of defense. But if they have good relations with Russia and China, why would they need that kind of incredible firepower of the United States? It would be the United States that would be the threat if they truly went to. Maybe I'm exaggerating here, but what do you think about that?
I think the Europeans have been ambivalent, maybe the Brits least so, but I think the Europeans have been very ambivalent about the China question for a long time. They in their habitual way, they feel obliged to follow the Americans. Remember the 5G business with Huawei and all that. Oh no, the Americans have outlawed Huawei. Well, we must do the same thing, right? Um, but Carney, well, he's not a European, but he's in that sphere, right? He just came back from Beijing, um,
Yes.
and and agreed with the Chinese to begin importing electric vehicles, which the United States has banned, right? And there's just too much advantage for the Europeans, too much good sense, okay, um, for good relations with China. And in the end, I think with Russia, right? We go back to the old argument, what is Europe? Is it, how is Europe going to define itself in the future? The eastern end of the Atlantic Alliance or the western end of the Eurasian landmass, right? And I think history is going to tilt Europe in the latter direction. And I
Yeah.
think they know that.
We hope so.
Yeah,
Europe could break the U.S. empire. It's despite Trump saying we don't care about you, they have so much power there that if they could break with the United States and have good relations with Russia and China and the rest of the world, the U.S. would suffer enormously. They need Europe to project power, especially towards
yeah,
Russia. But yet the problem there is Germany and Britain about Russia, and that leads us to Ukraine. So let's move on to Mr.
yeah,
Volodymyr Zelensky, who said he was not going to go to Davos because of the situation of the Russia destroying the heating of civilians in Kiev in particular. And I thought when I read that, there's no way this guy who loves the limelight more than anything, maybe a substance that people say he enjoys might be more. I don't know, but I think he loves being there, rubbing shoulders with all the big boys and girls and Ursula, etc. He was going to go to Davos. I knew he would go to, and of course he did. And there's
yeah.
one adjective that I've heard, if anything, any Europeans or even American leaders have criticized Zelensky for in these last years since the Russian invasion, where he's been lauded as the new Churchill, they've used the adjective ungrateful. Because they're all the money and all the weapons, everything that's been given to Ukraine, he's always asking for more and he's complaining. And he did that in this speech. Now, what did you make of his speech where he really blasted Europe and he saw an
Interesting,
opening there to go
interesting.
after them?
Yeah, interesting question. I don't know how many people share this interpretation, but I go back to the Biden years, right after the Russians began their intervention, right? Um, Zelensky was incessantly rude to the Biden administration, right? You're not doing enough, like, I mean, I suppose rude is the best word for it, really discourteous, blunt, ingratitude. It's almost too weak a word, right? And I concluded, wait just a minute here. This guy has string at the end of his fingers, right? I concluded then that Vladimir Zelensky doesn't do a goddamn thing that he's not told to do. And his instructions through a considerable part of the Biden regime were, now you get over there, Vlad, and you give us hell. You tell us it's desperate, we need more weapons and this and that and the other. It'll do us a lot of good in manufacturing consent and getting it through Congress, your next tranche of who knows how many billions of dollars. That's what I think he was doing in Davos. European opinion, I haven't done any polls. I'm sure they're out there. But I think European opinion, public opinion, is wavering and has been for quite some time, right? Apart from people who may be changing their minds, there are considerable constituencies in Germany and France. The Italians are a story all their own, who are saying, what are we doing this for? Right? Um, and, I think that Zelensky got up there in Davos on the instructions of the core players here, Merz, Macron, and Starmer. And they said, now, Vlad, you get up there. Remember how you did it with Joe Biden? Do it again, right? Give us absolute hell, be objectionably rude, so you make the front page, and all will be, you will have done the job. I just don't think the Times piece said, he risked the goodwill of the Europeans when he spoke so forcefully. I don't think Vladimir Zelensky would risk the goodwill of the Europeans for 5 seconds. Why would he do that? That's my take. I'd love to hear yours.
It's very interesting. So Europeans are saying we need a good slap in the face and do it.
Yeah,
Then that will get who? Trump to turn around, or the European public. I think that's what you're talking about. But why would
that's what
Europe?
I'm talking about the European. I'm
Yeah,
talking about public opinion.
yeah.
I'm talking about wavering public opinion in Europe. The Trump people are, Trump's going to do what he wants with Ukraine, and he's already doing it. He brags now about, we're making money on Ukraine. We're selling the weapons to Europe, and the Europeans are selling them on, right?
Yes, he
I
said that.
was, yeah, I was thinking of the European public, but maybe there's another end to the stick that I missed.
Why would Zelensky, who wants desperately to join NATO, and that's really the core of this entire crisis, why would he say this? Today, Europe relies only on the belief that if danger comes, NATO will act, but no one has really seen the alliance in action. If Putin decides to take Lithuania or strike Poland, that myth again, who will respond? Who will respond? If you send 30 or 40 soldiers to Greenland, what is that for? What message does it send? What's the message to Putin, to China?
Why did he say that?
Yeah.
What's the, uh, I think it's an adjunct of his basic theme. Uh, I'm here to urge you to show some spine. And this is one way you have to do it. If you can't stand up for Greenland, you're going to, in the end, you may not stand up for Ukraine. I think it was I think that stuff was of a piece
all all
with what
showbiz.
I'm
But I
saying.
still want to join NATO even though you suck. You're weak. Okay. Let's let's move since we're on Ukraine. I want to talk about this before I get to Sy Hersh's article about Russia's attacking of um, heating of the electricity grid system, which is
Yeah.
apparently creating widespread suffering in a very cold stretch. We're in January in the northern hemisphere. It's very cold in Ukraine. I want to know what you think about why Russia's doing that, and is that crossing a line into really uh, going against civilians? It's something that close to breaking the rules of war.
Well, Americans are forever saying we're going to sanction the hell out of Iran so the people suffer and rise up, right? With the very height of cruelty and inhumanity, right? Even if it worked, it would be un, unquestionably inhumane way of aggressing, right? Use the suffering of the population. Uh, I don't think the Russians are about that. I really don't think they're about that. In the piece I gave you this week, I think the Oreshnik that landed in Kiev, Lviv,
Lvov, yeah, Lvov, yeah.
J- J- January 8th, I think it was, right? Uh, I could be overinterpreting this, but I think it was sort of, if not an announcement, a measure of Russia's, I'm not going to say impatience because they've been admirably patient, and I'm sure they will continue to be patient. Um, uh, I think it was a measure of the extent to which they've given up on uh, the West coming to terms acceptable to them. Okay, and this is I don't think they're attacking the citizens of Kiev. I don't think this is a hair split either. I think they are debilitating Ukraine's productive capacity, right? And the energy resources and so on that power it. Okay, uh, I don't. I don't know the extent to which the Russians, this has been said in the past, they're very mindful of minimizing civilian casualties. I'd like to believe that, right? I don't know. I'm not going to pretend I do, right? But these attacks, I don't think even the Oreshnik resulted in widespread Ukrainian
No, it
casualties.
didn't. And I think you're
So
right.
they're after infrastructure,
Yeah,
right? They're after
yeah.
infrastructure.
That's what Russia says. They're doing these are military targets because it erodes their ability to create munitions and to move the trains, etc. But it
Yeah,
has a human consequence, the lack of heating in Kiev and other cities. And I think that that's something very questionable. And I think there's no question Russia has until now absolutely tried to avoid civilian casualties. There was an article I remember a couple of months into the war, just in sometime in 2022, when MSNBC had this piece and they quoted an unnamed intelligence defense agency, a U.S. Military intelligence officials saying that Russia is purposely avoiding casualty. They could have done this and that. They could have been a lot more ferocious, and they don't want to kill civilians. And I think that has been, unlike Israel, where people have. I saw somebody accusing Russia of committing genocide in Ukraine. I mean, it's so absurd. And these are the same kind of people who will deny Israel
yeah.
is committing genocide. That's so
Genocide.
politicized. But I do think
Yeah,
that this crosses a line. It may have a military purpose, but the consequences, you have to look at proportionality. What's the human suffering and what is the military value? That's just a question I'm raising about this, because I think up until now, Russia could argue that they've done everything they could to avoid civilian casualties. But this, to me, puts that into question. I just wanted to raise that
yeah.
before we're going on to Sy Hersh.
Okay, okay. Look, first point, I think that we must be mindful. The Russians have been shelling drones, missiles, uh, Ukrainian energy infrastructure, power grids, and so on for a long time. This is
Yes.
not new. This is not
Not on
new.
this scale, I don't believe. But anyway.
No, right. Uh, and they seem over the past couple of months to be hitting Kiev more often. I haven't got a measure of that, right? But I think, going back to my original point, I think the Russians have concluded we want to get this done. They don't like this war. There are liabilities for President Putin. We want to get this done and let's proceed. That's it.
Yeah, and it's not to break Ukraine. Then you don't believe?
Yeah,
Try to
yeah,
break them.
yeah. I mean, and they want to get they want to bring some sanity and sense of coherent judgment to the Europeans. You know, parenthetically, the Russians and Ukrainians reportedly met in Abu Dhabi today directly. You must have heard about that. Direct talks. Um, uh, oh boy, what's going to happen here? Maybe a settlement. You know, you're always going to read this stuff in the Western press, right? My take is I could be proven wrong. It would be nice if I were, but um, my take is the Russian door is always open. Why not? Right? Let me make another point here pertinent to this one. You read all these things about the outstanding issues, territorial disputes and territorial sovereignty over this or that section of Ukraine and so on, security guarantees, post-war reconstruction plan, and so forth. You never read about the larger issues that Moscow counts as core. You never read about the security framework uh, defining relations between Russia and the West. This is number one for,
Absolutely.
unless I rate it inaccurately, this is number one for Russia. And they're not even talking about that, you
Yeah.
know? So I just don't think Abu Dhabi is going to be at all
Mhm.
productive.
Well,
I'd
you're
like to
right.
be proven.
Russia leaves the door open, and because they want to negotiate those two treaties that they put to NATO and the United States in December 2021. I think I've been saying this for a long time. It's going to come back to that. This war won't end until Russia gets what they want out of those treaties, and
Yeah,
therefore they're willing to discuss that. What did those treaties want? The U.S. will and NATO will pull back their forward deployments from the former Warsaw Pact countries. They could stay in NATO, but they don't want troops there, particularly removing the missiles from Romania and Poland that are offensive capability that really threatens Russia, and they want NATO, Ukraine to be neutral like it once was. Neutrality doesn't join
yeah,
NATO, and the U.S. pulls back their troops. Those are the two main components of that. Until, if Russia gets that tomorrow on a dotted line signed by somebody representing the United States and NATO, the war's over. But that's not
yeah.
happening. They are sending
No.
now. They want us. Europeans are still talking about sending the troops there, or there's an American security guarantee, etc. But let's move on to Sy Hersh, if you don't mind, um,
May I make one
Patrick.
final
Yes,
point?
please, please.
Okay, the escalating attacks, the Oreshnik is part of a larger uh, campaign, escalating campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure, and we find it worth remarking upon because it's getting rather heavy going. Okay, the Russians listen very carefully to what's going on among the Western powers, right? And they're perfectly aware that their concerns, their larger concerns about security and so forth, have been written out of the script. Uh, I have a hard time imagining that this escalating attack on targets in Ukraine is unrelated to the failures of the West, their insistence on the Western powers to remain in fantasy land, right? Fruitless nonsense going on among them.
Yeah,
Just that final point was,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. The essence of this conflict has been both sides see each other as the aggressor. Russia has clearly seen the NATO expansion, the coup in 2014, the attack on Russian ethnic people in Donbass as an aggressive move by the West, led by the US against Russia and Russia's interests right on their doorstep. And The United States and Ukraine and Europe believe that Russia's poised to overtake all of Europe. They want to conquer, reestablish the Russian Empire. How many times we've heard Putin wants to reestablish the Russian Empire? Does he want to take Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, or Armenia, and Georgia? Is he going to go and take? That's the Soviet Empire. Is that what he wants? No, of course not. He has no designs on Western Europe. But
You,
Europe, the United States, has designs on Russia because they used to run Russia in the
yes,
1990s in the
I,
person
I think it's
of Yeltsin,
absolutely,
another indirect rule, by the way.
yeah. I think it's absolutely essential that independent media keep this reality in front of readers, listeners, viewers, right? Causality, right?
Yeah.
Second point you just raised, forgive me, uh, the European leaders believe that Russia has designs all the way across to the English Channel. Do you think they really believe that, or are they just excellent bullshitters in the cause of maintaining maximum tension, right?
I
I
think
mean, are they?
ignorant people, somebody ignorant like Kalakalis might believe that, but the more intelligent leaders who are listening to their military advisors know that Russia is not capable of doing that, even if they wanted to.
Yeah, yeah. Clarifying point, right? Yeah.
Okay, so
Anyway,
Sy Hersh
sidebar.
is leading into the idea that Russia wants to take over all of Europe, that Russia's on the verge of collapse, that the economy is dying, that Putin is surrounded by internal enemies, that this whole thing is a utter disaster for Russia. While you look on the battlefield and they keep taking one village after the other. What's going on with Seymour Hersh?
Well, a couple of stats on the way in. Russian GDP 2024 was 4.1%. Pretty damn good. It's slowing. The IMF has it down to 0.6% last year, 2025. Not brilliant, um, but not a catastrophe. Purchasing power parity, okay? Russia's purchasing power parity is $7.14 trillion. You need some perspective there. That puts it fourth in the world. PPP, as the economists say. China's ahead of it. The United States is ahead of it. India is ahead in that order. Russia is ahead of Japan, Germany, France, Britain, and then an assortment of other companies, Brazil, Indonesia, and so forth, right? Let's do the ruble. At the time of the special military operation, the ruble sank to 135 rubles to $1, pretty low, right? It's now 78 rubles to the dollar, pretty substantial recovery, right? So just some stats to put this conversation in perspective. I think Sy Hersh is a certain kind of reporter. His memoir is called Reporter. Okay. There are, in my little notion of things, our craft, there are two kinds of journalists. They're analysts and they're empiricists. Okay. They're analysts who take in facts and assign a useful meaning to them. And then there are the empiricists. I call them pane of glass reporters. Okay. It comes in and it goes out and they don't touch it. I think Sy is trained in the latter tradition. Not really my kind of journalist, but that's okay. Some excellent journalists have gone at the craft that way. I think that's what Sy is doing. You mentioned Scott Ritter's done a long piece on this and described Sy as a prisoner of his sources. I get his point, but I object. I don't think he's a prisoner of anything, right? I think this is the way Sy works. And I'll go one further. I think that piece was extremely useful because it gives us a nice little window, complete with a stereo speaker, on exactly how the American security state continues to think about this. You know, you read these pieces. Preparation for this conversation, I cut out a piece from the New York Post, uh, very often an interesting read, an opinion piece from last summer uh, by some retired general. I just couldn't believe it. I mean, it was worth clipping. Uh, Absolutely deranged assessment of Russian weakness and so on and so forth, right? So this is how these people think. And I think Sy, how do I want to put this? Sy got it right in reflecting this opinion very, very accurately. And the opinion is what's dead wrong. Am I being too kind?
We don't need Sy Hersh to do that. We have the New York Times every day to do that very thing, to filter and launder the intelligence deceptions. So, because people, if the CIA makes a pronouncement, the public might say, "Well, that's the CIA." They engage in deception. That's what intelligence do. But if the New York Times is publishing, while the New York Times still has the credibility it does somehow, then people are more apt to believe it. So we don't need Sy Hersh to do that. We need Sy Hersh to do what he's done throughout his career, which has made him maybe the greatest investigative reporter in U.S. journalism history, and that is to actually go against and expose things that the U.S. government is doing. Abu Ghraib, not that long ago, starting with My Lai and then Abu Ghraib.
Yes.
That's just bookending a career in which he exposed crimes by the United States.
And
That's
more
something we've come
recently,
now to think of Julian Assange doing, but this is a mainstream reporter in the US.
yeah, more recently, Nord Stream, the
Nord
Nord
Stream.
Stream piece, 5,008. I thought that was a masterpiece of professional
So
diligence.
I think that Sy maybe is, I know from interacting with him, particularly on the Seth Rich story, which I don't want to discuss today. We could do it at another time. But he was working on that story and finding out some very interesting things. And then
I
he backed
heard.
off. He backed off, and he's denied everything he ever said that we heard on the tape, on a tape recording. Now, with someone in which he said he talked to an FBI source, and they had Seth Rich's computer, and he was asking for money from WikiLeaks to get the DNC materials that WikiLeaks got that they claimed they didn't get from Russia. That Sy Hersh said on a tape, an FBI source told him that Seth Rich, this DNC employee, was the source of the DNC leaks to WikiLeaks. He's backed off that completely. Okay, so I also think in an interview we did with him on CN Live, and I tried to push him in a certain direction about Russia, I think it was, and he didn't want to go there. He said he gets in trouble. I think the phrase, if I go there. So I think he has sensed that he maybe gets a lot of shit from people in the administration and some of his sources. I think he may be trying to make amends or balance his reporting a little bit. Number one, or number two, he doesn't really understand what's going on. And right, he's not all knowing. No reporter is. And I'm not
Yeah,
sure that he's really done enough reporting on what's going on between Russia and Ukraine
yeah,
to not
yeah,
fall prey to this planting of rubbish story that he willingly reported, which he should not have.
yeah, yeah. I'm interested. I'm interested. You live in Washington. Do you see him a lot or what?
No, I've no. We did a CN Live with him. I've talked to him on the phone and emailed him. I don't see him a lot. No, I can't.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know if he'd be.
Well,
He's not a kind of warm, fuzzy guy anyway. If you
yeah.
know him, it's, he's
I
quite
look,
cantankerous and aggressive guy. But I have enormous respect, as many people do.
when Sy started the Substack, it occurred to me, I watched it immediately. I think I still subscribe. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I do. When he started it, I said, gosh, in my terminology, golly, Sy's a reporter. He's an empiricist. What kind of pool is he going to swim in here? Substack, you got to do a lot of interpretive work, right, to make it go, right? And I wonder if he just isn't, to mix metaphors, at the wrong end of the garden with this stuff. What he's been trying to do since he started the Substack newsletter. I'm a little uncomfortable uh, anatomizing Sy Hersh's late career, but this is not the first time he's had it wrong, right?
No, I also wonder if he doesn't miss being in a mainstream publication like the New York Times, the New Yorker, the London Review of Books, uh, and then it was I think Tagesspiegel or no, the Zeit
You had it. I
in
think you had it
Germany.
right.
They were the last ones, and they all have shunned this guy because he's taken on the establishment in a way that he has. Before uh, Nord Stream. I'm talking about the Bin Laden story. In other words, he has revealed that the United States worked with extremist groups in Israel and all. So he maybe wants to get back in. I don't know. I'm really, as you say, I'm uncomfortable psychoanalyzing the guy. But we're
Yeah,
trying to figure out why he wrote this story, and we can only guess. But it's yes,
yeah. It
he's
would
gotten it
be.
wrong before, and I would have been more comfortable with more than one source on the Nord Stream. But it makes so much sense. And then we had Biden saying openly, "We're going to take down Nord Stream," and we had Newland testifying to the same effect to Congress. So I
Yeah,
mean, they signaled it. That was the United States was behind it. Whether it happened exactly the way he wrote it, it may be up to question. Maybe Ukrainian operatives were involved with the U.S. I don't think Ukraine could have done this on its own. I think
no,
clearly the U.S. was involved, but again, the way it happened may not have been as easily described as his one, basically his one source. But I don't think we should ditch Sy Hersh because of this one bad story. We're just trying to figure out
certainly
why he
not.
wrote it.
Yeah, you said we can only guess why he wrote that. Somebody should call him up and ask him. You know.
Oh, you're not going to get very far if you did that, believe me. I can assure you. I can assure you, he won't let you speak. He's a master filibuster. If he does start talking, you'll never. Chris Hedges interviewed him once. And Chris asked one question, and it was a half an hour show. That was it.
Oh, really?
I
Is
think he
that
got
right?
maybe one more in at the end, but then that's the same thing he did with us, by the way.
It's an
Uh,
agonizing interview when that happens. You ask somebody what time it is, and 40 minutes later, right?
okay,
Uh,
for our last topic, I want to move on to a vote on a new law that took place in Australia this week
yes,
and whether that could happen in the United States. I wrote a piece about it. I will tell you what it is, and I also show how right now, according to the way the U.S. Constitution is written, and based on Supreme Court judgments in the past, they could never pass a law like this. And that law was simply that it's a new hate crimes bill. It allows intelligence agency, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, or ASIO, to work with the government, namely the Home Affairs Minister, like the Interior Minister of other countries, and the Attorney General, to collaborate in secret about putting organizations or groups on a banned list of hate groups. And
yes,
anybody who's a member of that or shows some kind of support, not necessarily material support either, but support, and a lot of this is very vague. That's part of the problem. If they show support for this group, they could be imprisoned from 10 to 15 years. 10 years if you didn't really know that it was a prescribed group, you were reckless about it, or 15 years if you absolutely did know and you still supported them. Now,
and
I just
if
want to
I'm
bring,
reading it if I'm
yeah,
reading it correctly, Joe, no transparency. The process by which this designation is assigned is completely secret.
there is a oversight only by the government and the opposition party in parliament. And nobody else really can get a look at this. And that is right. There is no due process. The person
Yeah,
who's or group that's being put on this list or the members, they have no due process. They don't know what's happening until they're found out they're on the list, and they could be arrested. Now, to the
shocking.
credit of the mainstream, and I'm going to ask you your views now. The credit of the mainstream reporters on two main television here in Australia, that would be ABC, and I can't remember the other one. They interviewed the Attorney General and the Foreign Minister Penny Wong, and they pointedly asked both of them, does this mean someone who says that Israel has committed genocide, could they be arrested and go to jail? And neither the Attorney General nor the Foreign Minister would answer that question, other than to say it's up to the ASIO, the security, which is the FBI in Australia, and the Attorney General and the Home Affairs Minister. That's the answer. And the Attorney General was asked, a lot of people are saying this is the kind of legislation and laws you get in authoritarian countries. And how do you
War
respond
times.
to that? And the Attorney General said, well, we went through the worst terrorist attack in the history in Bondi Beach on December 14th. So, in other words, yes, it's justified to have this kind of draconian law.
Yeah.
Your
This,
thoughts,
this
Patrick?
is all this is all post Bondi and or Bondi,
Right.
I suppose, right?
Yeah.
And they jumped on that instantly, right? You have apparently you know it better, way better than I suppose I should put this as a question, but it seems to me that the Zionist penetration into the upper reaches of the Australian government and administration is very, very deep, right? You know, now law, right? The Brits did it uh, with the Terrorism Act of 2000. They're banging that around like a club, right, at the moment. I think it's a question of method when it comes to the Americans, you know. I don't see us passing laws. Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Canada, they're different parts of the Anglosphere, right? I don't think it would be our way to pass laws. I think it would be our way to corrupt laws already on the books, right? That's what that's what I think our method is. But it's the same thing. I want to add one thing. This all landed with me many thousands of miles away when I read something Caitlin Johnstone wrote the other day. Some innocent woman had what they call a pocket dial on her phone. It's in her purse or whatever, and a number is dialed by accident. It has happened to most, if not all of us, right? And it happened to reach the telephone number of a Jew, and nobody was there because the woman didn't know she dialed. This woman apparently is now about to, forgive me, I'm not quite sure the status of her case, but she's either been arrested or she's going to be arrested or something like that. It's when I read that, I just said, this is getting way
I
too.
believe she was arrested because that person felt intimidated by someone calling and not saying anything.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
all
yeah.
this law takes, by the way, on certain aspects. It's a very complex law, and I've been working on it. I did a long piece, and we interviewed one of the senators who made a great speech in the Senate against this bill. He came on our show, David Shoebridge, and even he said I would need days to talk to you about this bill. It's so complicated. It was rushed through within 1 week after it was first tabled, and
Yeah,
24 hours after the deal was made between the Liberal coalition and the government to make amendments, and the other parties were given 10, 12 hours to read it and vote on it. The public was given 48 hours to submit their opinions. 48 hours, 48 hours.
yeah,
It's an absurd pushing through. But a part of one of the things they've taken away is intent. You don't really have to prove, in certain instances, the intent of the accused. It's enough for the alleged target or victim to say, I felt intimidated or fear. That person could go to jail for that. And this is an instance, and that happened before this bill was passed too. I don't know what law they used in that instance that Katie was writing about, but that did
yeah.
happen here.
I urge our audience to recognize this as the front edge or one of them in a rather concerted attack on dissent throughout the West. The Germans are going to town. We already mentioned the English. I don't know whether you know about the English have gone one further. A British friend of mine was telling me about something called NCHI, a non-crime hate incident. That means you didn't do anything wrong, but we're knocking on your front door anyway, right? It's just they wield that for gender questions and all that sort of thing, but it's on the books, you know. I find this. We must not be asleep to this, you know. The Germans, the Brits, and the Australians seem to be leading the pack for one or another reason. I don't know, right? We Americans have different ways at it. Uh, do we need to mention Minneapolis and so on, right?
Well, we
What
will.
happened?
That's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to mention not only Minneapolis, but Miami and
Yes,
Washington,
tell me.
D.C. Uh,
Tell me about Miami. What happened?
All right, the Miami case is the mayor of Miami Beach as a fiercely loyal Zionist. And there's a woman who has posted criticisms on him and pro-Palestinian statements. And I don't have the language in front of me, but she upset him so much that the mayor, had the police go and to her house. And I believe she was arrested. I'm going to look at the story by the judge. But the point is, Judge Napolitano wrote about it. And in Washington, a Washington Post reporter had her home uh, entered by the police, and they took devices because of an article she's working on in which she's had supposedly 1,000. She's contacted over 1,000 people about some investigation she's doing into whistleblowing.
Yeah, yeah,
So, and there's ICE now taking a 5-year-old kid into custody in Minnesota and using, tear gas and pepper spray. Now a court has said that they can use that. So we, as you said, they're not creating these laws because the laws are difficult. U.S. has the First Amendment. The the premier of the state of New South Wales, Chris Mims, was said on TV the other day that he watched a news report of protesters in New York City outside of a synagogue pr- chanting pro-Hamas slogans. Who knows what those were? Probably from the river to the sea. He said, "We don't have a First Amendment in Australia, and we won't tolerate that. You're not going to be able to say those kinds of hateful things against the Jewish population." So the guy's openly saying this is this
yeah,
idiot premier of the state that I'm standing in. I'm in New South Wales right now. So I'm in the middle of this, and he said this. So the First Amendment would, of course, not allow anybody to be arrested for something that they said, where this law does, as long as the person saying I felt threatened is a reasonable person. That's the test, by the way. The authorities will determine whether that's a reasonable person or not. Well, the guy who got a butt call and says I felt threatened, that doesn't sound reasonable to me, but that's the test that they have to
yeah,
pass. Um,
yeah,
it's so we have had court decisions like Brandenburg versus Ohio in '69, in which the Supreme Court ruled that speech advocating hatred, even violence, is protected unless it's directed at inciting imminent lawless action. Has
yes.
You could promote hatred. The Nazis, neo Nazis, Ku Klux Klan, they are permitted in the United States. So we have a wide. This will not happen in Australia, but as you pointed out, there are ways around it in the U.S., aren't there? There are ways around it.
Yeah, no, look, one point as I was reading up on this, we're getting this over and over now. Hate is a perfectly natural human emotion, if emotion is the right word, right? Attitude, response, whatever. Hate is a perfectly natural human. We are encouraged every day to hate not Russia, but I love the phrase Vladimir Putin's Russia, right? Um, to outlaw hate is just a one-way ticket to extreme oppression and of speech and also thought control, right? Are you going to be arrested if somebody discovers you're in a pub and overhears you and you hate someone or whatever? Hate. It's a hopeless and very dangerous pursuit, outlawing hate. Right. That's point one. Point two. I read that Judge Napolitano piece that we kicked around before this evening. Now he's a lawyer, quite useful sometimes, and he reminded me of something I had forgotten since civics class. Um, Free speech is a right, a natural right. It's a natural right. The government does not have the authority to grant it. It has the authority only to protect it. And we are being elbowed into a circumstance where the government claims the right to grant it or take it away. No, that's again another dangerous case. I think we Americans are out front on in this recognition, maybe with Tom Paine and so on, right? But free speech is a human right. No, his phrase was a natural right. You know, we mustn't lose sight of that.
That's what the framers said. This is a point the judge makes over and over again. And I want to just clarify that the woman's name was Rachel Pacheco in Miami, and she posted a
Right.
tweet against Representative Randy Fine, calling him a hypocrite for supporting free speech of those who want Israel to take over Gaza, but opposing the free speech of those who want a Palestinian state. And then she got a visit from two Miami police detectives asking if she had placed the post. She refused to answer, told them to leave, and they did. So that's just a chilling incident.
Yeah.
No arrest was made. I just wanted to clarify that. But that's
Yeah.
bad enough, isn't it? It's really bad.
Oh, just I don't know where we're headed. David Brooks, sort of the thinking man's conservative, if that's not a contradiction in terms, right? David Brooks had a piece in this morning's paper called "The Coming Crack Up." Okay, and he made the point that something, I'll truncate here, something is going to have to give very quickly. Our trajectory is simply not sustainable. And you and I now are talking about one way this is so, you know.
Well, Patrick, I wanted to thank you for being with us this week on The World This Week.
Well,
And
you're welcome and thanks for having me.
we will be back again next week to discuss, I'm sure, a few more disturbing developments in a world that seems to be spinning off its axis. For Consortium News, seeing live, for our producer, Cathy Vogan, we thank you for joining us this week on The World This Week. Goodbye.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
If you are a consumer of independent news, then the first place you should be going to is Consortium News, and please do try to support them when you can. It doesn't have its articles behind a paywall. It's free for everyone. It's one of the best news sites out there, and it's been in the business of independent journalism and adversarial independent journalism for over 2 decades. I hope that with the public's continuing support of Consortium News, it will continue for a very long time to come. Thank you so much.